Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
A very warm welcome, esteemed viewers, to this edition of the Mena-Watch Talks. Today we once again have the pleasure of speaking with Thomas von der Osten-Sacken. He's actually been a guest here with us quite frequently. Lately we've mostly been preoccupied with Iran, for rather obvious reasons, of course. Of course, that will also be the primary topic of discussion today. But we'll also broaden our perspective to encompass other regions that are presently dominating the news. So first of all, a very warm welcome, Thomas. It's great that you've even made your way to Vienna in person this time. Let's start, perhaps let's go back chronologically with the wars and how they are handled. The latest ceasefire or truce that was agreed upon concerns Israel and Lebanon. This is a peculiar arrangement, as Lebanon and Israel are establishing a ceasefire or truce, despite not being actively engaged in conflict with one another. This agreement is being brokered by a third party that lacks a direct voice in the negotiations, yet is very much involved in the fighting, not for the sake of Lebanon, but in the interest of Iran. And so everything is very convoluted, totally botched. What exactly is transpiring here? What importance do such agreements made by Lebanon actually hold? Will Hezbollah adhere to them? What do you anticipate will unfold from this point forward?
Hezbollah agreed, didn't they? So that's that. Because we don't have a war between Israel and Lebanon. Rather, it's a conflict between Israel and a militia that holds significant sway within Lebanon. This militia is backed by Iran, and despite having been designated a terrorist organization by Lebanon, it surprisingly still maintains a presence in the Lebanese parliament, and is the second largest employer in Lebanon, which is actually quite difficult to disentangle and fully understand. So, overall, after the recent elections in Lebanon and the formation of the new government following the war last year, or rather the year before, it's abundantly clear. The Lebanese government intends to disarm Hezbollah. However, they are unable to do so because, after decades of neglect, the Lebanese army remains far too weak to accomplish this crucial task. The US is not actually waging a war against either Lebanon or against Israel. Israel, too, evidently has minimal interest in this ceasefire, but was compelled by the Americans to agree, as Iran stipulated it as a fundamental prerequisite for any negotiations with the United States. Or did I not adequately manage to cut through this thick and dense thicket of information?
Well, if I followed it this past weekend, it's really quite unclear what precisely was agreed upon, or rather, what was not agreed upon at all. The State Department released a summary of the agreement's content between Lebanon and Israel. It's not talking about a general halt to military actions at all. Instead, it explicitly states that Israel reserves the right to defend itself and to initiate active responses if it comes under attack, and so forth and so on. That remained on the State Department's website for only about a day or so. Immediately, the American commander-in-chief spoke out, unequivocally declaring, "Israeli attacks are absolutely forbidden, full stop." So, once again, nobody knows what exactly was agreed upon.
Moreover, we also don't know what the next step would actually be if this ceasefire were to truly hold and be effective. Well, actually, the two warring parties should really be negotiating with one another, shouldn't they? Hezbollah would never directly negotiate with Israelis. Thus, the current point of contact would now be the Lebanese government. But what could be negotiated with the Lebanese government, which demonstrably lacks the power to disarm Hezbollah? Had they possessed such strength, they would have acted long ago. So, what's truly interesting is in the polls. Shortly after Hezbollah became involved in the war, for the very first time in Lebanon, a significant majority, including a substantial number of Shiites, expressed extremely critical and negative views concerning Hezbollah's actions and overall presence. And people definitely didn't want yet another war. This implies that Hezbollah is waging this war against the clear majority will of the Lebanese population, who genuinely desired normalization, peace, and similar outcomes, acting essentially on behalf of Iran at the specific behest of the Iranian regime. So then, who exactly would be the appropriate contact person for finding any kind of solution in Lebanon? Is it Iran? Because without Iran, Hezbollah couldn't continue. Is it the Lebanese government, or is it Hezbollah themselves?
And on top of that, it's completely unclear because everyone agrees that Hezbollah should be disarmed except for Hezbollah themselves. It's truly perplexing.
Exactly.
But who is supposed to do it is completely unclear, much like with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So the only thing you can say for sure is that no international troops will go in there to disarm Hezbollah or HAMAS. The Lebanese army, as you correctly pointed out, is nowhere near strong enough to handle this situation. Therefore, Hezbollah is militarily a considerably more potent force than the Lebanese army currently stands. That means the only ones who could do it would be the Israelis, but they're obviously not supposed to either, if they even could.
Yes, plus, of course, the Israeli tactics are not going over particularly well in Lebanon either. I mean, we mustn't forget there are over 1 million internally displaced persons in Lebanon who are living somewhere in tents, if they're not staying with family, somewhere in tents on the street. Of course, this particularly affects, as always, for example, refugees from Syria and also guest workers. And this has been going on now for about 3-4 weeks. Lebanon is a country where we always used to ask ourselves a few years ago, when will Lebanon actually become a failed state? And what happens when Lebanon becomes a failed state? Well, Lebanon became a failed state, and actually nothing really happened. When I was last in Lebanon, it was truly difficult, to even try and figure out any prices there anymore. So, for decades there was this fixed exchange rate, $1 to 1,500 Lebanese pounds. I have no idea how many millions the Lebanese pound is at. So, Lebanon is economically, socially, and in many other aspects absolutely broken, completely ruined by its thoroughly corrupt elites, And there was just a bit of hope last year for a new beginning, for changes, which always play a very significant role in the Middle East. We must not forget in Lebanon either. In 2019, there were these mass protests in Lebanon that were incredibly significant because, similar to Iraq, they crossed confessional boundaries for the first time. So, and you tend to forget this development amid all this strange geopolitics. Thus, in Beirut, for the very first time, primarily young individuals from all diverse confessional backgrounds came together to demonstrate, you see. Lebanon, like Iraq, is extremely divided by confession, and they declared, "We are Lebanese now. We want an end to corruption. We want an end to all of these ongoing warlike conflicts. We want a future." And that is ultimately, and then Corona hit hard in both countries where this development was very similar back then. And that is, of course, now a situation where a lot is being called into question again. Because how exactly are you supposed to care for 1 million internally displaced people at a time? And this is a global situation right now, when aid is simply being drastically cut. It doesn't matter which conflict we examine, UN organizations, and we can say what we want about the UN. But at this juncture, it is simply their duty to ensure the absolute minimum of emergency provisions are in place. UN organizations regularly state, from the funds we urgently need, we only receive between 15 and 25% from the West or from this so-called international community. This applies to Sudan, to Lebanon, and essentially it holds true for all nations. So, we're talking about parallel conflicts on the one hand. Mass displacement, like what's currently taking place in Lebanon, coupled with a complete inability to even ensure people's very basic needs for survival. And it used to be different. In disasters like the one currently unfolding in Lebanon, regardless of its duration, there would have been a corresponding aid program to ensure that people had food to eat, some form of shelter, and similar necessities. This is a parallel global development we are currently witnessing. And what this all truly signifies for the future of Lebanon, especially considering Israel, and you'd likely know more about this than I do, is trying to re-establish that security zone it once maintained before having to withdraw, or rather did withdraw in the late 90s, early 2000s, is apparently attempting to re-establish that very security zone to effectively prevent rockets from being fired into northern Israel. That too is a contradiction. If I establish a security zone by actually destroying villages and rendering them uninhabitable, I'm essentially operating under the assumption that Hezbollah will persist there for years and decades to come to continue launching rockets into Israel.
Well, it's probably just about the physical possibility to eliminate their ability to operate.
But if my goal is to disarm Hezbollah, to transform it from an armed militia into a political party, transforming Hezbollah, an armed militia, into a political party, Hezbollah isn't just going to vanish, but I also need to ensure they're not still raining rockets on me in 10 years. So these two strategies aren't necessarily, well, that could be plan A and plan B, but this security strip, with its occupation and so on and so forth, will certainly not be perceived as a friendly act by anyone in Lebanon, regardless of who they are. And that's precisely why it will lead to the consequence that in these 5-10 kilometers that were designated yesterday, the map, was published by the IDF, right? People can't return there anymore. So where will these people then live, huh?
The situation naturally is greatly complicated by the fact that the political, social and societal conditions in Lebanon are already challenging enough as they stand.
Yeah.
Hezbollah, in effect, could be described as an Iranian occupation army, supported and maintained by the Lebanese themselves. But it's not just that, because there's also the large Shiite population group who, in essential aspects of their lives, are indeed dependent on the services provided by Hezbollah and naturally subsequently by Iran. Without any proper regulations or arrangements for their continued advancement, Hezbollah won't just simply disappear into thin air.
It won't simply vanish from the... We must always remember that in this confessional context. Until the early 80s, the Shiites were, so to speak, the poorest population segment of Lebanon, those with the least opportunity. The most impoverished segments of the population traditionally having the fewest opportunities in political representation and typically engaged in rather, lower-tier professions. They were looked down upon whether by the Christian or Sunni side. The Islamic Revolution, which was primarily a Shiite movement, led to the significant empowerment of Shiites in Lebanon through groups like Hezbollah and Amal. It's interesting to note that initially the Shiites were actually allied with Israel, in a manner of speaking. It's almost unimaginable today, the images of Israeli tanks rolling into southern Lebanon, being showered with flowers. This was because the Israelis were simply seen as allies against the other various elements within this Lebanese confessional fabric. Shiites in Lebanon are also grateful for that, for the fact that they play this enormously important political role today. This means the idea of crushing Hezbollah is completely politically, economically, and socially false. The question is, if Hezbollah were to more or less become independent from Iran, would it be possible for them to transform into some kind of legitimate political party? Because Hezbollah is similar to, this is the Iranian strategy, that nations are not merely taken over, but instead, within those nations, quasi-para-state, paramilitary organizations are established and developed. These organizations, on the one hand, erode the state, exerting considerable influence upon it, while on the other, they control vast territories to such an extent that the state effectively loses all sway. That's Hezbollah, of course, in Lebanon. Those are the Houthis in Yemen. And then there are these Hasht al-Shabi militias operating in Iraq. And that has proven to be an enormously successful strategy for Iran because they can always claim we're not genuinely responsible for it, but they are pouring billions into these nations, into these movements. However, simultaneously, Hezbollah is ensconced within the Lebanese parliament, has appointed its own ministers, and actively forges alliances with Christian political factions, among others. So, the question then becomes, is there really a way to fully transform Hezbollah into nothing more than a purely political party?
Well, I mean, you did mention it's quite illusory to believe Hezbollah will just vanish. I would counter that it's just as illusory to believe that Hezbollah can somehow separate from Iran. Well, I mean, that's an Iranian creation. It is entirely financed, equipped, trained, and heavily armed by Iran. So, Hezbollah without Iran is simply not Hezbollah, plain and simple.
Hezbollah without the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Yeah.
Therefore, this brings us right back to one of the central fundamental points of these overall regional conflicts. As long as the Islamic Republic of Iran exists in its present form, there will simply be no solution to this problem. This means that without a fundamental change in Tehran, truly nothing substantial can be achieved in either Lebanon or Yemen, as that constitutes the very foundation and capital of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Without Hezbollah, without the Houthis, and previously without Assad, and without the Hashd Shabi in Iraq, Iran would play no role in the Middle East, that is, in the traditional Middle East, would it? This is something that Iran has systematically established and developed truly ever since the early 1980s, precisely to ensure its presence in that region. So these are, so to speak, the symptoms of the Islamic Republic, wouldn't you agree? The notion that we can just tinker with symptoms without tackling the underlying cause, this has been the Western and American foreign policy for the last 30 years, has utterly and completely failed. And it has failed. This has truly been the situation, starting with the Bush administration in the 90s, then Clinton, then Bush, who thought one could wage an Iraq war without confronting Iran, and then with Obama, who pursued this appeasement strategy. So this is a structural problem. If a regime change were to occur in Tehran, then Hezbollah would seriously need to consider, what course of action do we take? Because then, the flow of money and weapons would simply vanish, and then it would be forced to articulate a truly national Lebanese stance, acting as a lobbying organization for the Shiites.
Okay, let's pick up on that. What's the situation with regime change in Iran? So far, well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask the US president, as we know, regime change has already happened. It doesn't exactly give the impression that this is the kind of regime change that would alter everything. So far, the regime has actually managed to maintain its power. You've often mentioned this. We've certainly stressed this in our conversations. In a conflict akin to the one the US is prosecuting against the Iranian regime, or more precisely the Islamist regime in Iran, their paramount concern is simply to somehow endure, rather than to harbor illusions of military victory, a feat they demonstrably have not achieved. But at the same time, one must also say, okay, if that's what a victory looks like, then they definitely cannot afford such a victory, not by a long shot. So, the destruction, everything that has taken place in Iran over the past 6 or 8 weeks during the war, has undoubtedly set Iran back even more significantly than it already was before. The economic crisis was already terrible, and the problems are now much bigger. At the same time, Iran, even though it's trying to present itself as a victor, is more internationally isolated than it probably ever has been, or at least the Islamic Republic is.
Let's separate.
And people always get criticized for that, quite rightly, by Iranian exiles, who vehemently state that is not Iran, and they are absolutely correct. Iran's entire strategy didn't really pan out. The idea that Hezbollah and others would play a major role in the war just didn't come to fruition as envisioned. Similarly, the notion that one could attack the Arab states and thereby exert pressure on Trump, or rather Israel, was also a strategy that didn't pan out. That obviously didn't work out either, so the Arab states, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia and so on, are now much more united in their front against Iran or against the Islamic regime than they were before. So even in that instance, there were clearly quite a few rather simple strategic miscalculations made, weren't there?
Well, yes and no. If we had been sitting right here just 6 weeks ago, in the first days of the war, and if someone had put a gun to our heads and forced us to make predictions, which I would very reluctantly do, none of us would have expected that after 6 weeks. The Islamic Republic of Iran, without central figures such as Ayatollah Khamenei, Ali Larijani, and other crucial leadership figures essentially possessing the power to unilaterally dictate the game's rules, which is precisely the situation we have encountered, wouldn't you agree? I mean, yesterday the US was talking negotiations, and today Iran says no negotiations. So they've actually performed remarkably well in this situation. I truly don't know what their precise strategy was, if indeed they ever had one at all. However, they effectively drew the Gulf states into this conflict, creating a situation of extreme uncertainty with consequences that are proving to be very, very difficult to fully gauge. Hezbollah has now entered the war, which in the end undeniably led to it becoming a multi-front conflict, a situation no one truly anticipated. In Iraq, Iran has been very, very successful to date. I mean, Iraq itself is yet another front. And internationally as well. Everyone's talking about the US and not about Iran. So when I read the newspapers, I mean, regarding whether or not. So that's not exactly unsuccessful either, particularly from the standpoint of asymmetric warfare, where the sole objective is simply to avoid defeat.
I mean, in the international reaction, a huge factor, or the main factor, of course, is simply that Trump is in power in the US, and he just conducts himself in the manner that he does. And that, of course, really does open up enormous opportunities for them, doesn't it? Let's get back to the Arab states, I mean the Gulf states. Nevertheless, I would argue against that. In recent years, there was, among other things, this rapprochement mediated by China, or whatever you want to call it, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example. Well, they had already, even after it became undeniably clear, especially following that nuclear deal struck with Obama way back when, made efforts to somehow, in one form or another, reach an arrangement with Iran, with the Islamic Republic, you see. For the moment, that's history, at least for the foreseeable future. So the Arab states, the Gulf Cooperation Council, are issuing statements saying, yes, making arrangements is no longer an option. We require comprehensive solutions encompassing all these specific points, and that has already...
Play devil's advocate. If Pakistan takes any action, it does so because the Saudis are providing their backing discreetly in the background. This alliance is incredibly tight, isn't it? For Pakistan to suddenly act as a mediator, Pakistan of all places. I mean, we don't need to get into specifics about Pakistan, but we all know what it's like. That Pakistan is suddenly playing such an incredibly vital role, and the Pakistani government has recently visited Iran, holding discussions there. That Islamabad is now the location where the initial negotiations are taking place. This somewhat contradicts the notion of Iran's significant isolation, primarily because Pakistan has historically been a staunch ally of Saudi Arabia. Moreover, the Gulf states have a long-standing tradition of maintaining dual relationships. This means Saudi Arabia, in particular, will be carefully considering what happens if some botched, unsatisfactory agreement is struck between the US and Iran, leaving Iran de facto with continued control over that wretched Strait of Hormuz. And then what? They'll be forced to reassess their position and determine their next move. We have to look at how we can try again, somehow to manage this with an Iran that has been weakened to get into business, you know? And that's exactly the game Iran keeps playing, time and time again. So in 2009, when, in my opinion, the real regime change should have taken place during the massive protests against Ahmadinejad. At that time, the elderly Khamenei, as we later discovered, genuinely contemplated leaving the country for several days because the entire regime had truly been shaken to its foundations. A strategy of the Obama administration, explaining why they chose not to back the opposition and didn't declare, "We do not recognize these elections," was rooted in the notion that a weakened Iran would be more amenable to having our terms dictated to them. Right. And Iran has always exploited that extremely well. So, pretending to be weakened, and then through negotiations and negotiations, months and years of negotiations, they've basically managed to push through their own interests again. And the Iranians are extremely good at that.
But whether this trick will work again is very questionable, especially since, as I said, Iran's economy was already devastated before the war, and now it has had to endure further massive blows, including significant damage to its industrial production sites and other infrastructure. Firstly, the reconstruction of Iran would take an eternity, and secondly, there's absolutely nobody willing to fund such an endeavor. Iran simply cannot achieve that on its own. And while the Strait of Hormuz is certainly a strategic ace up their sleeve at the moment, it's ultimately what you'd call a one-trick pony. So they can exert pressure with it now, but naturally with some years of delay that will also undoubtedly lead to a reorientation in other countries as well. New pipelines will be constructed to bypass this strait. Larger reserves will undoubtedly be established, and this will undeniably accelerate the transition to alternative forms of energy. This is also, so to speak, a trick with a very limited shelf life.
Now, after 35 years of working in the Middle East, I have to say, people don't plan in terms of years. The perspectives, even in the daily lives of individuals, seldom reach further than a few months, because everything can swiftly change again. Therefore, I certainly don't assume that this Iranian regime is currently walking around with detailed 10-year plans tucked away in its pocket.
Not the Iranian regime?
Exactly. That's first and foremost about trying to survive on a week-to-week or month-to-month basis. Because as I've said again, every single day that the Iranian regime manages to survive, it hasn't truly lost. And every day it hasn't lost, the other side hasn't won. That's the logic. And that's how for decades the Taliban, for instance, perfectly held their ground. In the end, they won in Afghanistan simply because they never lost. Yes.
Or at least because they never admitted that they lost.
That's enough. The history of the Middle East or North Africa, as we've known it over the last 30 years, is one where suddenly very, very massive changes take place. And that is, people have that in their blood, so to speak. As a very good friend of mine always puts it, the Middle East simply doesn't possess a linear history. For 10 years nothing happens, and then so much happens in 3 months that you can barely tear yourself away from the computer, and so on. Then for 5 years nothing happens, then in 3 months who knows how much. And that is basically the historical development in the Middle East. We've certainly been able to comprehend this perfectly over the last 2 decades as well. This is something that Iran lives with and can handle, that is the Iranian government. That means I would definitely say at this very moment, economically, the situation in Iran is absolutely catastrophic. Iran's situation was catastrophic in December. Mass protests in January began, because an already completely catastrophic economic situation worsened so dramatically that the dollar to real exchange rate surged past 1 million. What was particularly significant in January was that these protests initiated in the bazaar, and it wasn't just students demonstrating, rather, the movement originated in the very economic heart of Tehran. And these were truly the very first protests where essentially all segments of the population were deeply involved, you see. Civil servants, individuals from the business world, and also from the various nationalities. That was different before. Back then you had teachers protesting or truck drivers.
Students.
This was it. It had now reached all societal strata of Iran. It was the economy. Stupid. And I believe the real is now at 1.7 million, and there isn't really a real-based economy left anymore. So basically, Iran is now transforming into a dollar economy because the currency's decline is simply so rapid. Of course, the situation has become even more drastically, significantly worse also, for instance, due to this internet blackout, which very few people are actually discussing. I mean, that's 6 weeks without the internet. And in Iran, there are also thousands and thousands of companies that are completely dependent on the internet, you know. They all go bankrupt, they can't conduct their businesses, they can't communicate, and so on and so forth, which, on the other hand, naturally plays a very significant role as people are unable to organize themselves. Because everyone keeps asking, where's the Iranian street uprising? How can you organize mass protests without the internet in 2026? I mean, what really needs to be emphasized again is the Twitter revolution, which actually originated in Iran, comes from Iran. So, back in 2009, the Green Movement and those massive protests occurred, and it was entirely due to the internet. That was the very first time it truly gained global recognition. What an incredible and powerful organizational tool social media enables, truly showcasing its immense power. All the protests in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya would have been unthinkable without it. Because such a great danger emanated from these social media platforms, and because they were so incredibly subversive at the outset, reactions emerged as part of this, shall we say, global counter-revolution spearheaded by Russia, China, and Iran after these protests. How can we truly prevent the internet from continuing to be such a profoundly subversive instrument as it has been? And there were various reactions to that, yes. Russia, with all its fake news, was a part of it. So we simply flood the internet with all sorts of nonsense until absolutely no one has any concept of what is truly real and what is false.
Or those troll factories, things like that.
Precisely, that's Russia's response. China's approach is, we'll disconnect from the internet, create our own, and effectively censor the global network beyond our borders. And the Iranian one is, when things get really dangerous, we simply switch off the internet, plain and simple. So only a very, very few state-affiliated people still have access. And the American reaction, which one shouldn't forget plays a huge role, is this. We'll simply just acquire it, like Elon Musk and Zuckerberg, until it's in the hands of some oligopolies, or belongs to some former billionaires who can then exert direct influence, much like Facebook declared just the other day, which they did yesterday. Therefore, the term ANTIFA is something we will no longer tolerate, considering our current community standards. And then what we do is simply deactivate accounts, and naturally there have been various counter-reactions to all of this. We also talked about it before, like in Nepal, Madagascar, or Morocco, how people can bypass those restrictions using certain gaming platforms. And Iran simply took the precautionary step of completely shutting down the entire system, making it possible for only a very limited number of individuals to gain access, and that too, with extremely low and restrictive kilobyte speeds. I notice it too, how rarely I get news from Iran anymore. I was always quite well informed, you see, because I have a great many acquaintances in Iran. And now, unfortunately, Starlink access points are also being tracked with the help of Russian and Chinese technology. We must never forget this when we talk about Iran, because it plays a significant role. Iran is also a world war, in the sense that the Russians and Chinese are constantly providing Iran with information technology support. Starlink access points are now relatively easy to pinpoint and locate. And that's what makes it dangerous. Starlink users are immediately arrested. So that's always the double meaning of an internet blackout, which you never read about in German newspapers, what it actually means, even though any of us would just have to imagine. What would our lives look like after 3 weeks without internet? We wouldn't be able to book any tickets, we couldn't communicate, and we wouldn't have a clue what's happening in the world. Economically, this also carries immense importance. But now, of course, the fundamental problem is that this Iranian regime, as is well known, cares nothing for the well-being of its population. The Iranian regime has operated like an occupying force for many decades now. This means that widespread impoverishment and economic decline do not pose a substantial threat to the regime as long as it can successfully suppress protests that emerge from these difficult economic circumstances. And it definitely can erupt, something we've been aware of for many weeks now. The Basij militias are everywhere, the Revolutionary Guards are everywhere. When 40 people gather somewhere in Tehran, it's immediately perceived as a threat. This signifies a noticeable increase in internal repression. And within the Iranian regime at this very moment, I can't say what will transpire in 2 months' time, this conflict has significantly bolstered a younger cadre of Revolutionary Guards. These are individuals who emerged from this repressive apparatus, and they already control a substantial 60% of Iran's economy. And some of these people were very heavily involved in these repressions, and they have no problem with executing a few thousand people. And that can actually work for quite some time. We always tend to think, our European perspective on completely desolate countries in the Middle East is always, this simply cannot continue. And then you realize that a completely broken country like Syria under Assad went on for another 10 years when basically nothing worked anymore. That means these decaying regimes function for a relatively long time. Because I must confess, regarding Iran, I truly never anticipated, especially after the 2009 protests, the economic decline, and all the intense internal conflicts and struggles within the country, that it would manage to endure for such an extended period. But it did. So I myself was always far too optimistic about the demise of this regime, so to speak. In that respect, I must say that one always has to say, our wishes must simply not become the father of our thoughts. I also tend to fall into that trap. I want this regime to disappear. I've genuinely wished for it for decades, but one often realizes that the desire tends to drive you a bit more intensely than it should, than by the stark, grim reality of the situation.
Let's talk about the grim reality. So my assessment at the moment, and we should say we're recording this conversation. Today is Monday. In 2 days, this ceasefire between Iran and the US, which was originally limited to 2 weeks, is set to expire. What will happen next, nobody truly knows. My current impression is that the Iranian regime is quite content as long as there's no immediate fighting, and negotiations can once again resume, stretching out for weeks or even months on end. From the American perspective, it doesn't really seem like Trump is particularly eager to restart any bombing campaigns, even though he's certainly making threats. That's certainly part of his approach, of course. So I'd venture to say the most probable outcome is that there will be some sort of continuation of this non-state that we have now. Or how do you see that playing out?
It's incredibly difficult to assess. Because on the other hand, there are reports that the Americans are really replenishing their supplies down there, bringing even more ground troops into the Gulf region there. And this non-status, economically speaking, simply isn't sustainable in the long run. We're seeing it at the gas station, aren't we? With a double blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and so forth, oil prices. One of the US ministers stated it wouldn't drop below $3 before the midterms, indicating continued high prices. We all know the severe impact that exorbitant gas prices have on inflation. Quite frankly, fertilizers that don't come through, helium. So this non-status is something that I believe cannot be maintained for a very long time. That could be sustained with Iraq in the 90s because Iraq didn't really play such a central role, you know? That period between 1991 and 2003, with occasional bombings, sanctions, and then this and that, that was truly a terrible time. It's just simply absolutely not possible to maintain. I also think that so in the long run, whether we're discussing it today or whether we were talking about it 20 years ago, Iran itself is simply not the problem here. The uranium in Iran is not the real issue. The long-range missiles in Iran are also not the central problem. The Islamic Republic itself is the actual problem. Well, the ongoing question has always been, is the Islamic Republic an actor with whom one can rationally negotiate? Can we use pressure, sanctions, and promises to eventually reach some form of coexistence? Because it truly doesn't matter which American administration has confronted this challenge. Or is the Islamic Republic fundamentally an irrational actor whose primary objective is the destruction of Israel, the destabilization of the entire region, the propagation of, and we absolutely must discuss the nature of this regime, an extremely aggressive Shiite? Islamic ideology is so fundamentally central to it that even though it can act with pragmatic rationality to achieve its specific goals, the core purpose of its very existence remains irrational, therefore making its ultimate downfall an absolute necessity, which, as is well known, is something that 3/4 of the population in Iran now desires. So it's not like we're dealing with a regime that has the enthusiastic support of a large part of its population, as might have been the case back in 1980. And so we're now facing that exact same question again, only after a war and this whole affair. Is this regime something that can be negotiated with, or is it that with this? So, to phrase it differently, do negotiations with this regime even make any sense at all? For decades, my assessment has been no. For others, in Europe, for instance, it's yes. If you say the assessment is no, that means this regime has to go.
All right, but what does that truly signify in this particular situation? I mean,
yes, we are confronting this exact dilemma. So, 6 weeks ago, at the outset, a significant portion of the Iranian populace and ourselves believed this is it, the war. That leads to the downfall of the regime, and that's exactly how we initially perceived it to be led.
Although I would say, and this might sound strange, but it's impossible to say right now, I mean, nobody really expected a major uprising against the regime to break out while the war was still ongoing, did they truly? What you're seeing now, as you mentioned, very little news comes from Iran. The little information that does filter out reveals the immense presence of various armed regime agents patrolling the streets, including women draped in chadors, perched on pickup trucks equipped with machine guns parading defiantly through Tehran. The regime is clearly in a state of immense panic, fearing new protests, and is employing every possible measure to prevent their eruption.
Let's take a step back to the topic of warfare. So, I can conduct two types of wars, two different kinds. I can conduct a war where I pursue a political objective, a la Clausewitz, you know, and say, if I can't achieve this through diplomacy, then we'll let violence be the decider. If I emerge victorious from this war, but my goal is for the opposing government or the opposing sovereign to remain in power because ultimately I seek a negotiated solution, much like what transpired, for example, between Austria and Prussia, especially since we find ourselves in Vienna. The Prussians weren't trying to overthrow the Austrian government. The Prussians intended to expel Austria from Germany. Thus, to achieve that, I ultimately needed an Austrian government that was both strong and sufficiently sovereign. To acknowledge the capitulation, we lost the war, and these goals were achieved, and then it's over. Then we would re-establish diplomatic relations, and so on and so forth. Or I would wage a regime change war, as was done in Iraq, where you declare, the opposing government is illegitimate, and we want absolutely nothing to do with them. In the end, all we want is at most an unconditional surrender, like in 1945. That wasn't even the case in Iraq. I mean, nobody on Saddam's side even surrendered, not a single soul. In the end, that government is gone. We're going to occupy the country and implement a real regime change, just like it happened in Germany in 1945, in Afghanistan in 2002, and just as it did in Iraq. So the opposing government is illegitimate. I have nothing to negotiate. At most, I can exchange POWs with them while they're still in power. When this war started, the statements from Trump and Netanyahu, at least, were clearly pointing towards a regime change war. You know, this is an illegitimate government. It massacred tens of thousands of its own people. It has waged 47 years of terror against the US and Israel. It has to go. If I declare that goal, it's very difficult to say after 3 weeks, let's negotiate, because if I say let's negotiate, I'm not waging a regime change war. It doesn't matter what I say, exactly. And that's just one of those many contradictions that make the last 6 weeks completely unpredictable, you know? And ultimately that actually strengthens Iran even more again. We have to consider, what if the 2003 war against the Ba'ath regime in Iraq had somehow taken a wrong turn, and then, after just 3 weeks, George W. Bush had said, we'll now sit down with the Iraqi delegation and negotiate about weapons of mass destruction, while countless people in parts of Iraq were celebrating in the streets and had provided intelligence to the Americans and so on and so forth. Right? Or like in 1991, when the Americans called for an uprising in Iraq, and the people in Basra and the entire south, and later in Kurdistan, rose up, then everyone simply watched as it was brutally crushed. So here we are again, grappling with the fundamental problem of a complete lack of strategy, because I cannot. I mean, that is, so to speak, a self-excluding contradiction. So either I wage a war with a very clearly defined objective, and acknowledge the opposing party even during the war itself, or I choose not to, in which case the whole point of the conflict becomes moot. What exactly is it that has been happening over the last 6 weeks?
Well, if one can take seriously the media reports about it, for instance, there was a rather extensive report in the New York Times specifically about the immediate period of decision-making on the American side concerning the decision for war. It's pretty clear from that, at least as far as the military and security circles in the US are concerned, that they said from the very beginning this whole idea of regime change is basically bullshit, so to speak. That's not going to happen. And they also said we shouldn't declare that as one of our war aims. We can't achieve it with the means we're willing to commit. So from the US military's perspective, it wasn't fought as that kind of war, neither planned nor executed that way.
But a war has political and military aspects and a psychological one, doesn't it? Which, in terms of war theory, roughly make up a third, and a third.
Yes, and then there's the Trump factor.
Yeah, but I really do love Sun Tzu. I'm not sure if you've ever taken the time to read The Art of War by this Chinese general who lived way back 2,500 years ago, wrote this little primer on warfare, which was always on Churchill's nightstand. He said a lot of smart things. And one is, you will always lose a war fought with tactics but without strategy. And tactics are actions taken by the military, strategy is determined by politics. So here we are obviously dealing with a contradiction between the strategic and the tactical objectives, aren't we?
I would say it really depends on who you're asking. So naturally, if you were to set aside the entire Trump factor and focus solely on the actual events and the historical significance of the war, along with the accomplishments, so to speak, of this particular conflict, of the last 6 weeks, you have to say, if the goal was to set back the Iranian nuclear program for a long time, that was certainly achieved. If the goal was to destroy both the drone and missile production facilities, for the most part, that was certainly achieved. If the objective was to dismantle a substantial portion of the resources enabling Iran to exert military pressure, so to speak, within the region, then it's highly probable that this has indeed come to pass. So, from that particular standpoint, I would argue that the war was quite an extensive success. But it's certainly not a political triumph. That, of course, once again relates to Trump, and to the fact that it's actually unclear at what specific juncture the war was even intended to be a success, so to speak. So this is Trump's problem. He never has a moment where he can credibly declare himself the victor. Although that's an interesting point. In the upcoming May issue of Commentary magazine, Jonathan Schanzer writes an article where he says, yes, maybe we also need to let go of that idea. In actual fact, since the Japanese Empire in 1945, no country has ever truly acknowledged its defeat. Instead, wars have always concluded in different ways, somehow or another. So perhaps that's an antiquated idea that there even still exists such a thing as a decisive victory followed by an unconditional capitulation.
That's quite right, but we have 2 points on that. First of all, if you have the tactical objective, to basically repeat what Western and especially American Iran policy has been for the last 30 years, which is always, we'll try. To delay matters with sanctions, through negotiations and so forth, that Iran continues to enrich its uranium further. We must not forget that Iran today has uranium enriched to 60%, which can then be very, very quickly enriched further. That threshold's long crossed.
Assuming there are corresponding enrichment facilities, which probably don't exist at the moment, at least.
But according to expert opinion, that's enough for 10 bombs. And it's not gone. It's just somewhere, you know. And the know-how exists too. Thus, the consistent policy regarding Iran has invariably been, we aim to delay Iran from building these missiles, from actually creating a nuclear bomb. We assume that is their intention. We attribute malicious intent to them, and we actively work to prevent it. Then this right here is the military version of that very thing. Also, Iran is now quite advanced with its missiles, which is rarely talked about. It has reached the Abulasya, you know. That's 3,000 kilometers. From Tehran, that would extend to Vienna, for example. So, Iran is lying whenever it opens its mouth. Uranium is more enriched, and their missiles reach further than he said. So the stance on Iran is, you desire it, and we must find a way to prevent that from happening. We can achieve that politically, and we can also achieve that militarily. Then, this war would be an attempt to accomplish militarily what is no longer politically feasible. Nothing more in terms of tactics. It would surely be successful, I don't question that for a moment. But then, that wasn't communicated politically. Then there was Trump's rather strange Truth Social video message, and Netanyahu's message, well, that was an entirely different story. I mean, those were the classic messages that you send when you want to wage a full-on regime change war. Because then, from a war theory perspective, we again have the question, what is our relationship? And I truly believe that this is going to play a really big role in the future. As a warring party, what is my relationship to the enemy civilian population? And this is again very, very important because people always forget this. So, if I'm fighting a traditional war, then the enemy civilian population is neutral. That means my duty as a warring party is to do absolutely everything to, all the Geneva Convention. I have to consider the enemy civilian population as neutral. I am waging a war against the military and the government, and I have to do everything to protect that civilian population. If I am waging a war to change a regime, then the civilian population of the opposing side becomes de facto my ally, which consequently means they become the enemy of their own government. That was definitely a classic case in Iraq, wasn't it? I mean, I actually work in Iraqi Kurdistan. The war had already begun. In Iraqi Kurdistan, there were barely 5 individuals who weren't in favor of the US. Right, but that means, as a warring party waging a regime change war, I have a responsibility towards a civilian population that is no longer neutral, and those points are completely missing for me right now.
Well, there were statements from Trump that definitely made mention of this. So, if you were to translate that into normal words, it was something like, we'll take care of the military part now, and then your time will come.
Yes,
But 2 weeks later, he stands up and says, we have a regime change and the new leadership is much cleverer and much smarter and we can negotiate with them now. That's just, again...
But these are the absolute points where one genuinely has to admit, setting aside all the Trump bashing, that this is the most utterly irresponsible thing conceivable. Because we are aware that there had been prior meetings and discussions with Iranian opposition figures, particularly with Kurds, Balochs, and others to whom various promises were extended. They, in turn, spied out target coordinates for the Israelis and the US, and in some cases even relayed information directly from Tehran regarding the locations and hiding places of Revolutionary Guards and so on and so forth. This means that old rule, and it's particularly important to me, especially during these crazy and turbulent times, that we truly re-emphasize and strengthen the humanitarian principle that underpins the laws of war. Thus, the age-old principle, we keep the enemy's civilian population out of this conflict as much as humanly possible, has been utterly disregarded. This, in itself, represents a profound violation of that fundamental ideal and conception. Right. If I do that, which I consider entirely legitimate because I believe since World War II at the very least, some of these fundamental prerequisites have been rendered obsolete, and it was perfectly clear that in France, in Italy, in Yugoslavia, and in many other nations, the civilian population was. The civilian population was aligned with the Allies, wanting to rid themselves of the Nazis and German occupation. Therefore, I bear a significant responsibility towards them. Right? And either, and if I'm obviously not aware of this responsibility in any way, that I have this responsibility, then I'm waging an extremely irresponsible war. And regardless of whether that's now it's propaganda or simply something that creates a negative mood. If I then declare my intention to wipe out an entire civilization, which would necessarily include the enemy civilian population that I had previously embraced as my allies, I am then entirely contradicting myself. And that has consequences, that we, from our perspective, not as statesmen, but as people whose goal is actually democratization, the overthrow of tyrants, a better life for people, because that's what we want for the Middle East. This also has consequences for the future. truly devastating consequences in every subsequent dictatorship, because ultimately the trust that people once had simply vanishes. And this trust in the United States, not specifically in Trump, but a broader trust in the US, has already been devastatingly shattered in Syria. This was a trust that had existed previously, you see, especially concerning the Red Line, the chemical weapon attacks, which, in a very similar manner, effectively undermined that confidence. Well, I see a quite devastating parallel in the policies of both Trump and Obama. So if we were to go back to the year 2013, there's this alliance of Western countries, Turkey and the Gulf states, calling themselves the Friends of Syria. And they say, we recognize the Syrian people as our partner, not the Syrian government, which is illegitimate. You say that when you ultimately want a regime change. So, this whole thing is more talk than actual action. But there are these conferences of the Friends of Syria in Istanbul and so on and so forth. Then, in 2012, Syria, specifically the Assad regime, which officially possessed no chemical weapons, deploys poison gas against its very own population. Then Obama declares, that is the red line, so if you continue doing this then, we will intervene militarily. Then in August 2013, Ghouta occurs, where it's absolutely clear that Assad is pushing that red line, testing it there as well, trying to cross it. I mean, you don't just unleash such a massive amount of poison gas on civilians, resulting in 1,500 deaths within 24 hours. That's the second largest chemical weapons attack against civilians after Halabja in 1988 in Iraq by the Ba'ath Party. And so, as a result, nothing happens. Or to be more precise, there is no intervention whatsoever. And then the Russians intervene and say, we'll make a deal now with the Syrian government to destroy it for the destruction of their gas stores,
which they always denied,
which they didn't even possess. But what this fundamentally signified, and nobody here ever grasped it, because everyone thought, oh, peace now, no more war, fantastic, at its very core. And this brings us back to the identical root issue. I'm acknowledging a government as a partner, because without the Assad regime, that poison gas couldn't be eliminated. Essentially, a government that just 3 weeks earlier I had declared illegitimate. And with that, all the chatter from the Friends of Syria was over, and it was internationally demonstrated. Our partner from now on is Assad. Okay, now we're in 2013. For me, that's the turning point. So if we reflect back, what exactly sparked all these catastrophes of the last 10 or 12 years? What was it, so to speak? Where did it all truly begin? It was this chemical gas deal. Afterwards, Russia felt so emboldened, so incredibly powerful, that it then proceeded to annex Crimea. It is only after that point that Qasem Soleimani then establishes, relatively unimpeded, really builds this, as they referred to it back then, this Iranian empire, by establishing and expanding this entire network throughout Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, alongside Syria, and with Hamas, and absolutely nothing is being done to stop it. Then ISIS comes. And what exactly happens with the Islamic State then? After the genocide of the Yazidis, which was just as predictable as Assad's use of chemical weapons after the genocide of the Yazidis, this anti-ISIS coalition is formed, which still exists today. And who is the de facto partner of this anti-ISIS coalition, even if not officially recognized? Iran and the Hashd al-Shabi, those Shiite militias in Iraq, who actually fought as ground troops together with the Americans, and at that time they became so strong because it was suddenly stated that anyone who fought against the Islamic State is our de facto ally, which is complete madness and was also part of Iran's strategy. We are aware that Iran had also covertly supported Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State behind the scenes. So, for Obama, Iran suddenly became a partner in the fight against the Islamic State, even after Assad had already been an ally. This occurred despite Assad's prior partnership. So, and I think that this is something that these regimes are really learning. We just need to manage to take that one crucial step. that we once again become a partner. So if some agreement now comes along where Iran says, yes, we will dispose of our uranium together,
or patrol the Strait of Hormuz together,
or they patrol the Strait of Hormuz or do anything at all, then it's that very same regime that actually should have been overthrown. And I've been striving for that very objective for many, many years now. For years I've held the view that this Iranian regime must go. To quote him once again, because I truly believe it's the most insightful statement, our driver, or perhaps our logistics officer from Wadi. He says, we have three problems in the Middle East. That's Iran, Iran, Iran. And that's precisely how it is. It means that the instant people truly believed there would be a war to bring down this regime, they, and indeed many, many Iranians among them, were absolutely ready to face unimaginable hardships, saying, okay, it's better to have a dreadful end, rather than this endless terror. But at the very moment that objective suddenly disappeared from the official discourse as well, one also assesses this war from a completely different perspective and asks oneself not whether it was worth it. It is always worth it when the threat from Iran is simply weaker than it was before. But what real significance does that truly hold for the upcoming years and indeed for the decades to come? Because I seriously doubt that any US administration following this particular conflict would in any way, shape or form, regardless of whether it's Democratic or Republican, really show the readiness to intervene in this specific manner anywhere else ever again.
Well, the next few years will tell. I'm a bit more cautious about that. Basically, people said the very same thing after Bush's war in Iraq, and as we've now seen, that assumption didn't really hold up for very long at all. But we shall see how things unfold.
Let's just emphasize this one more time, maybe just reiterate it. There's a great deal to criticize regarding Bush's war in Iraq, and I certainly do criticize it. Not the core idea of overthrowing Saddam, which I still deem absolutely right, but the execution. And there were various strategies concerning what was truly desired for Iraq. They completely contradicted each other, and that largely led to this initial, disaster, where the regime's supporters, along with some foreign-funded Islamists, built up this so-called Iraqi resistance movement. But the difference is, with Bush, it was perfectly clear it was about, I recently reread some of his speeches, it was fundamentally about the idea that every single person in this world deserves to live in freedom and democracy. That applies just as much to people in the Middle East as to everyone else. We all share a common objective. That's something I can certainly get behind. So with this particular war, even that is quite obviously it's also completely unclear. What then would truly be the long-term goal for an Iran under this Bush administration, so to speak? Well, they always hold up Venezuela as a model.
Bush.
Yes, Trump, this US administration. So, the great model was Venezuela. In Venezuela, they effectively neutralized the democratic opposition, didn't they? The distinguished lady who had previously received a Nobel Prize was essentially completely sidelined and excluded from the process, all to facilitate business dealings with that regime, specifically -2, to engage in business with particularly unsavory individuals. There was never any mention of democracy or freedom or anything like that, and Trump consistently brought up Venezuela as a prime example. That implies, furthermore, it remained consistently vague, assuming any such concept ever truly existed as to the precise vision for what a post-Islamic Republic of Iran was ultimately intended to become. Nothing tangible ever truly materialized from the US on that front. They stated, no Pahlavi, the Shah's son, he's a pleasant individual, but he lacks sufficient influence. Then they briefly entertained the notion of the Kurdish opposition played, but that was very quickly leaked to the media. So, not even the Kurds. taking into account all the internal tensions and contradictions within the extremely divided Iranian opposition, there's absolutely no clear guideline from the US administration on what direction this is headed. And with Bush, that was absolutely not the case. There was a clear vision. A federal Iraq with strong Kurdish self-determination, a weakened military, a parliamentary constitution, and free and fair elections. That was all. Those ideas were on the table before the first shot was fired and had been discussed for a year beforehand.
Then, I'm sort of flipping our positions now. Although in Iraq, of course, the very same argument can certainly be made, just as you've now put it in the case of a war with Iran. There were different strategies being pursued. Bush talked that way. Rumsfeld neither planned nor prosecuted the war in that manner. There was always talk of a light footprint, quickly in, quickly out. That's why the chaos unfolded as it did, because the US military absolutely had no intention of being a significant occupying force or even assisting with regime change.
Yes, but let's just say the true distinction lies here. Very obviously within Iran, there's a highly visible military tactic where the diverse factions of the military have indeed coordinated their efforts amongst themselves, yet ultimately there is either no unified strategy whatsoever, or perhaps even a profoundly contradictory one. In Iraq, it was the other way around. There was a relatively clear strategy in terms of what they actually wanted politically in Iraq. Militarily, different tactics were employed, right? That's how I'd phrase it.
That truly warrants its own separate discussion, but anyway, I would say we've already taken up quite a bit of time. I'd like to thank you once more for this insightful conversation.
Sure.
A few months ago, we spoke about Iran. Back then, we agreed that we would meet for coffee in Tehran in 6 months at the latest. I'm afraid that is no longer on the table now.
I would never say that. These are things, as I said, I want to emphasize this again. History in the Middle East is neither predictable nor linear. Even Assad, at some point, was eventually gone, when nobody anticipated it any longer. Let's not forget, the EU was in Damascus in October. In 2024 in Damascus, essentially to reach out and re-establish their presence and so on and so forth. Then, a year, or rather, a month later, Aleppo was gone. No one in December 2010 ever anticipated that just a year, a month, or even 2 months later, the entire region of North Africa would erupt in such widespread turmoil. And I would say it's exactly the same in Iran. We genuinely have absolutely no idea what's going to be happening there in 3 months from now, no matter what grand politics dictates. Nobody anticipated mass protests breaking out in Iran in December. Everyone had said it was over and so on. They came suddenly. That in January, the situation in Iran, the human rights violations, the oppression, and everything would suddenly dominate world media headlines, and that was one of the triggers for this war in the first place. The regime in Iran was already completely finished a year ago, so it could very well be that in just 6 months we'll be having a MENA talk in Tehran, or perhaps at the very least in Mahabad, serving as the capital of Iranian Kurdistan. Or it could be that we won't, but I think any prediction about what Tehran will be like in 6 months is absolutely problematic.
We don't even know what happens after tomorrow when the ceasefire ends. So, thanks again, Thomas.
Gladly. You too.
For being our guest once more. And to all of you, as always, our heartfelt thanks for your attention and a plea. If you wish to support our endeavors, please do leave a like on this video. Comment on this video or subscribe to this channel. And otherwise, yes, thank you very much and see you next time. Goodbye.
Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.